Hello and welcome to Hamer Reviews. My name is Christopher Hamer and today we're looking to answer the question, if you have a Z-mount Nikon camera, should you buy the 16 to 35mm f4 or the 14 to 30mm f4? It was a choice that I had to recently make and I thought this video might be useful for those that have the 16 to 35 or are trying to choose between that and the 14 to 30 because I couldn't find many videos actually comparing it, which was frustrating for me because I really wanted to see that comparison. I've owned the 16 to 35mm f4 for the f-mount for just under 10 years. I bought it very close to its launch. At the time I paid around £800 for it. I think there was a rebate on at the time, though it currently retails for £1,000, so it certainly hasn't gone down in price over the years. The 14 to 30 obviously launched last year, quite a bit more expensive at around £1,200 in the UK than the 16 to 35. Obviously their Z-mount lens, which we've seen have all been more expensive than their F-mount counterparts. Just looking at the lenses, they are very different. The 16 to 35 is fixed length, so the barrel doesn't change in size, though you can see the inside element move as you zoom. The 14 to 30 is the exact same setup as the 24 to 70 f4S, which I have here, which is that you need to extend it to use it. So as I extend it, it actually goes to full length at 14mm, and as I zoom into 30mm, it actually gets shorter. So interesting optical design there from Nikon. As I said, exact same as the 24 to 70 f4S, and in fact they're very similar in length, and they're also very similar in width as well. The only real difference is that the front of the 24 to 70 has a 72mm filter thread, whereas the 14 to 30 uses 82mm filter threads. I can actually explain why that's the case, and that is that the 14 to 30mm, 14mm is very wide to have a filter on the front. So in order to accommodate the filter and not get the edge of the filter in the actual image, they've had to move the filter thread out to 82mm to accommodate that. I think that was a great choice though, because being able to use filters on a 14mm lens is fairly rare. The 14 to 24 2.8 f-mount lens is impossible to use filters on because it actually has a really bulbous front element. So I actually really like this. So we have a relatively similar size lens once we extend them out. So they are similar in that, except that obviously the 16 to 35 remains fixed length and the 14 to 30 changes. Obviously the only changes aren't the sizes of the lenses. So in terms of technologies, you'd be probably surprised that the 10-year-old 16 to 35 has a few tricks up its sleeve that the 14 to 30 does not. The headline one is vibration reduction. I think when this launched there was a bit of controversy around why it had VR, but I think it was great. The ability to stop down to say 1/10 of a second and get a sharp image through VR was really great to have in this lens when it launched. And I think even with the Z6, it gives you an advantage of being able to use the VR in the lens alongside the VR inside the camera, so the in-body image stabilization. So I actually think having both of those does give you a bit of an edge. The 14 to 30 obviously doesn't have VR, given the fuss I made about it being in the 16 to 35. A lot of you are probably thinking, why should I care? And actually, I think it's a real shame. The reason being that if you have a Z50 that either you use as a backup camera or as your main camera, putting the 14 to 30 on it won't give you any form of stabilization. And I think it is actually quite important in this day and age to have that. So it's a shame Nikon didn't put it in there. Obviously, if you have the Z50, you might have the 16mm lens, the kit lens for that. I think 16 to 55, don't quote me, I can't remember off the top of my head. But the reason why I think it should have it is a lot of people buy more expensive lenses and cheaper bodies to upgrade the body in the future. It's certainly what I did with this 16 to 35. I bought it for use on D300, just like it's currently mounted on. But I knew that I'd be upgrading to full frame in the near future. So buying a full frame lens made a lot more sense than buying, say, a 17 to 55 2.8 DX lens. So a shame the 14 to 30 doesn't have that. The 2mm width, change in focal length is huge. So 14mm to 16mm is a bigger difference than 30 to 35 when you're actually looking at the image. I think 14 to 30 is a lot more useful. There's less crossover with your other lenses, and overall I'd actually prefer the extra 2mm on the wide end versus the 5mm on the long end. Hopefully you've already been seeing some images pop up which allow you to compare these two. So I've always taken the same aperture so that you don't get too much difference there. And hopefully it gives you a sense of the distortion levels, of the colors, of the contrast. I think color and contrast, they're quite similar, the 16 to 35 and 14 to 30, but in terms of distortion, the 14 to 30 is better. Partly, I think that is because it automatically puts in place some post sort of edits in Lightroom and Photoshop, so on. So it fixes some of the distortion automatically, but I think actually, in general, it's already better in terms of the optics. The quality of sharpness is also better on the 14 to 30 versus the 16 to 35. That's something I really noticed. So zooming into 100%, looking at the images that you're seeing now like that, they're definitely, the corners are sharper on the 14 to 30 and even the center's sharper as well. So from that perspective, the 14 to 30 is a big upgrade on the 16 to 35. The thing is, I think the 16 to 35 is perfectly usable. So if you're trying to choose between these two lenses, I would honestly say, can you deal with the length of the 16-35? Add the F to Z adapter and this becomes a very long lens. If you're using that in interior photography, it's probably going to bug you a lot, because it did me. You know, you may have the camera up against the wall to take a photo, but because the lens is sticking out this much from the front of the camera, you're actually quite far into the room, whereas the 14 to 30 makes it much easier to get that nice wide shot, not to mention the fact it's wider. Also, it becomes quite front heavy on the Z6 with the F to Z adapter. So again, is that something that's going to bug you? In that case, the 14 to 30 is the better lens. But if you don't want to spend £1,200, you'd prefer to spend around 500, then I don't think you can go wrong with the 16 to 35. It's still a good lens. I can't imagine it's going to depreciate that much more than it already has. So you can probably get most of your money back if you buy one used at the moment. I would not buy one at retail though. I was really shocked when they were still for sale for £1,000 new. That's so much money for a lens that's 10 years old that some people thought was flawed to begin with. Like, you would have thought that would drop the price, just the fact there was a lot of negative reviews, but it didn't, and it's very expensive now. So the 14 to 30 I think is better value than the 16 to 35, unless you talk used, because you can't get one 14-30mm lens used. So from that perspective, you know, do your own economics. If you can afford the 1200 and you were going to buy 16-35 news, get the 14 to 30. If you were going to stretch your budget quite a lot to get the 14 to 30, the 16-35 is absolutely fine. They're both good lenses. They both take great wide angle shots. In particular use cases, the 14 to 30 may win, but overall, I think you'll probably be happy with either of them. The 14 to 30 is a bit more customizable than the 16 to 35. The focus ring can become the control ring, which means you can change things like aperture settings with it. You can set that all up in camera. So perhaps that's something that you really like, in which case that's going to be the lens for you. You can't obviously program the focus ring on the 16 to 35. But overall, they're very similar lenses. They have very similar focal lengths, and they do roughly the same job. So really think about your budget. Do you need the extra sharpness? Do you need to be able to get into small, tight spaces with the 14 to 30? Then you're going to need that. But if you are thinking you'd really have to stretch your budget, is it worth spending that much more money? Probably not, to be honest. The 16 to 35 is perfectly good lens even now. Just don't buy one new, buy it used. I hope that comparison was useful. They are both very good lenses. If you have any specific questions, pop them in the comments below. Hopefully the images you can see are useful too, that sort of took you through how sharp they are, how wide, etc. And if you like this video, do give it a thumbs up because that really helps. Equally, if you haven't, do subscribe. Thank you very much for watching. I'll leave it there, and I'll see you again next time. Goodbye.